Hello, and welcome to week 10 of Applied Behavior Analysis. These are your lecture notes and PowerPoint for tonight's lesson over chapter 10. Our lesson outcomes here, we'll talk about antecedent events and how they influence behavior, different forms of prompting, we'll talk about fading of prompts, we'll talk a little more about task analysis and chaining, and then we will define shaping. So the first thing that our authors talk about in chapter 10 is that some teachers find it difficult to reinforce behavior that they never see. So when you think about your own case study, think about the behaviors that you most often see and that undesired behavior. Some teachers have a hard time seeing that students can actually show the desired behavior and sometimes get a little focused on the negative. So sometimes they find it difficult to reinforce that behavior. But just remember, desired behavior has to be shaped. If these students knew how to perform the desired behavior and were able to do that on their own without shaping, then we wouldn't be in this process of developing a behavior intervention plan. So when we talk about shaping, shaping is referred to, it's when the teacher molds or shapes the existing response or the undesired behavior into the desired behavior. So it's just shaping that behavior into what we want to see. How antecedents influence behavior. So again, talking about setting events. Setting events can be environmental, including the physical or instructional aspects of a classroom. Antecedent events and setting events can be manipulated to bring desired behavior. That can be accomplished by removing or preventing the occurrence of a setting event. And we'll work specifically on this in our case study this week, where we talk about prevention strategies. So what that means is we're basically just reducing the effects of a setting event or increasing the reinforcement to our benefit. And sometimes we have to do that when the setting event itself cannot be controlled. Sometimes we have to manipulate the antecedent more than we normally would if the antecedent is out of our control or the situation is out of our control. For example, if a student comes to school unmedicated, we may not be able to perform our tasks in regards to shaping that student's behavior like we normally would. Therefore, we may have to set up different setting events that day. If a student is experiencing any kind of trauma, maybe parents are going through a divorce, maybe there was a death in the family, maybe they've lost their home, anything like that that is out of the teacher or student's control. Sometimes we have to make adjustments in our antecedents or setting events to try and help shape that student's behavior. That may look like increasing reinforcement. That may look like altering our expectations. That may look like providing the student with some increased access to preferred activities versus non-preferred. Um, really, as long as we're setting the standards for the student as far as what they have to do in order to get that reinforcement, we're still in control of that. But just keep in mind that there are times where we have to kind of veer from our norm just because there are things that we can't control. So when you think about this in your own case study, and we'll talk more about this tonight when we meet live, but when you think about this in your own case study, think about what we have already defined as antecedents for your case study subject. So what are some setting events that cause the behavior to happen? Then we'll talk about how we can manipulate those setting events to get them to work in our favor. Are there elements of the environment, physical or instructional, that we as teachers can control in an attempt to shape your case study subject's behavior? So again, just keep those questions, those thoughts in the back of your mind. It will help you prepare for what we will be talking about when we meet over Zoom tonight. The next big idea we're going to talk about is prompting. So when we talk about prompting, A prompt is an additional stimulus that increases the probability of the desired response. So there are many different types of prompts. We're going to talk about the prompting hierarchy next. Um, but the first thing we're going to talk about is using rules and instructions as prompts. Um, Prompting can be used in explaining rules or definitions, and that doesn't always mean academic. The book gives an example of defining things such as politeness, honesty. Teachers are able to prompt students to identify those behaviors, what they look like, what they sound like, even what they feel like, what happens to our body when we exhibit those behaviors or when we see those behaviors. And then the same thing with instructions. When we think about instructions, giving instructions verbally, especially complex directions, is not always the best way to deliver those. Um, Sometimes we see that teachers view that as students not following directions, but rather they can't remember the steps when presented verbally, especially if it's a lot of steps. So just keep those things in mind as we start to talk about the prompting hierarchy here. So hopefully you've seen this before. This is the prompting hierarchy model, and some of the visuals look a little bit different, but they all follow the same structure. So you'll see that the model on the left-hand side shows least invasive to most invasive and most independent to least independent. It's important when we're prompting students that we always start with the least invasive prompting first, um, because what we want to do is get that student to be as independent as possible, and we want them to use the level of prompting that is least restrictive to them, least invasive, and we want them to eventually be able to independently demonstrate the desired behavior. For example, when we're teaching a new behavior to a student and we have to prompt them, we wouldn't start with a full physical prompt or hand over hand unless we have exhausted the other promptings, um, and we're unable to get what we want out of using the other prompts. So this is a great visual. Um, I particularly use this with paras or associates, aides, whatever your school calls them, to help them understand um, what we're trying to do and promote independence for these students and how we can move through the prompting hierarchy, how we can try and make our prompting as minimally invasive as possible so that these students can eventually gain independence. So it's just a nice visual to have handy. So when we start off on that least invasive level, visual prompts, these are probably the most common. Teachers use visual prompts without really even realizing that they are visual prompts. That can consist of a classroom schedule, classroom rules, bulletin boards in your classroom that have different visuals that are useful in the classroom, written instructions. When you talk about students on the autism spectrum, visual prompts are especially helpful. They can be used as written scripts, so maybe in a social skill, teaching a social skill to a student on the autism spectrum who does not know how to greet a friend, we can write them scripts to kind of help them through that process. Using video clips as models have also been proven as a highly effective strategy for students on the autism spectrum so they can see the behavior modeled. This can also come into play in checklists, work systems, basically anything else that can be presented visually to a student. And this, again, would be our least invasive form of prompting. The next level are verbal prompts. So prompts given verbally from the teacher. They can be given to the whole class or a specific student, depending on what that student needs. Sometimes it's helpful in using the student's name to gain attention. For example, we may think that verbal prompting is ineffective for a particular student because they don't respond when the class is being addressed as a whole. But sometimes students just don't cue in when they hear directions to an entire group, or sometimes they think that the directions don't apply to them. So, a way to easily kind of weed that out to see if that's an effective strategy or not is to include the student's name. So, if my student is Michael, instead of saying just as a general direction to the class, please take out your books, or please take out your books, I could say, Michael and class, please take out your books. And that would help cue that student in that that direction also applies to them. Doesn't work all the time, but it is a step to try before we get to the next level of prompting. There are also useful tools that we call self-operated verbal prompts. So verbal prompts can be pre-recorded for students to follow. It allows them to be a little more independent with that level of prompting. So what that may look like is, for example, giving a student a verbal prompt for, say, completing their math work independently. The different steps may be recorded so that the student may follow them and they're able to pause them after each step so that they can complete a step, pause it, and listen to the next step, complete it, and so forth. This can also allow students to evaluate their progress, and it's good to have them do that occasionally to see if they're completing all of the steps. When we are talking about older students, not necessarily younger students, but older students, and when I read through this, this really reminded me of students with disabilities in the workplace. So we always want to think about things that are socially acceptable. It's not uncommon for teenagers, preteens, even young adults to have earbuds in their ears, listening to music or whatever they're listening to. But we can do things like recording music with superimposed prompts to remind the student to work. So instead of, let's say, during independent work time, maybe a study hall, for example, for a middle school or high school student, instead of a teacher having to come to that student every few minutes and say, remember to keep working, remember to keep working, remember to keep working, we can set up things like music that has those prompts in it so that every few minutes it says, remember, continue working, remember to keep working. And it just looks a little more socially acceptable to their peers. Modeling is the next step there, gestural and modeling. The book talks more about modeling, and so that's what we're going to talk about now. Modeling is kind of the watch me. It's used when visual and verbal promptings aren't enough, and we need to actually model for the student what we want them to do. This is an effective strategy as most students will be able to imitate behavior. Even students with more significant disabilities can still model certain behaviors. Another effective strategy in modeling is to provide student models. So think about that with your physical arrangement of your classroom. How could you pair a student who maybe doesn't exhibit the best social skills or some of those desired behaviors that we want to see? How could we pair them with other students who would be a good peer model for them? We have to choose carefully because sometimes we can teach them behaviors that we don't want to teach them. So when we choose student models, we have to make sure that they're students who are similar to the student. We wouldn't want to pair a student maybe who is more cognitively impaired with a student who has some behavior concerns that may, again, inadvertently teach them the wrong behavior. We want to make sure that they're competent and they're able to exhibit the skills that we want to see, and that they also have prestige and they're a student that we can trust to do the right thing and help us with the process. Student models may need to be taught explicitly how to model and help reinforce appropriate behavior, as well as how to respond to undesired behavior. So it's okay to take a student aside. Again, making sure that it's a student who is going to be a little more mature and responsible, and not use the student's deficit as a way to poke fun at them or get them to do the wrong thing. Has to be a really good student that you can trust. But we can tell them, we're working on reinforcing Michael's behavior to stay on task, whatever that may be. And we can teach them what steps we're working on with that student and tell them, these are the things that I see that you model well, and these are the things that we want Michael to mirror and model. So we're really looking for you to be the good peer model here. And we can also teach them how to respond to the undesired behavior so that when Michael acts up and when he's off task and when he's trying to distract others, they know how to respond to that in a way that's not belittling to the student and in a way that's helpful. Video modeling is also a way of modeling that is really effective. This can be done with videos of others demonstrating the appropriate behavior. Some students prefer or respond better to seeing themselves engaged in appropriate behavior. So if we can ever get, some video evidence or even a picture of that student doing the right thing, those are helpful tools that we can use, especially when we talk about students on the spectrum. Video modeling is an extremely effective tool. Then the most restrictive is physical prompting. So any reinforcement that requires a physical prompt that can include a touch, such as a tap on the shoulder, tap on the hand. Obviously, we always want to be careful of where we touch a student. The safest place typically to touch a student is between the shoulder and the elbow if we have to give a gentle touch just to get their attention. Sometimes it's an assist where we have to kind of help the student show the correct behavior. In the book, they talk about raising a hand. So a teacher may kind of gently guide the elbow to help the student raise their hand. And then there is a full physical prompt, or also known as hand over hand, where we actually may have to physically get the student to do what we need them to do. That is not to be misunderstood with um, controlling their movements or limiting their movements. That is restraint, and that is something completely different. Hand over hand would be, for example, teaching a student to use scissors where we have to physically put our hand over their hand and teach them how to use the scissors correctly. It is, again, the most invasive type of prompting, so it's one that we want to avoid unless we've exhausted all of our other options. There's also, with technology, some really cool tactile prompts. If you've ever seen like the Revive bracelets, there's lots of different names for them, but we can use paging devices such as these bracelets that kind of vibrate or buzz to help keep their attention. And if we teach them that that vibration or that buzz means they have to focus back on their work or that they need to be in their seat, whatever behavior we associate that with, it's a way of giving a physical prompt without an adult actually having to touch a student. So those bracelets in different devices have been really effective, and they're kind of cool to see. Again, it looks much more socially appropriate for a student to have on a bracelet that quietly vibrates or buzzes that only they see and hear, than an adult having to go over and tap them on the shoulder to get them to pay attention, attend to their work, whatever that might be. So, the goal in when we think about prompting, we should always have the goal in the back of our mind that eventually we want to fade these prompts or withdraw them from our teaching to make that student as independent as possible. When we gradually remove prompts, that is what is referred to as fading. So prompts can be faded in a number of ways. The book lists 4 main ways. One is decreasing assistance. So that's when we move from a more invasive prompt or the most invasive prompt to a less invasive prompt. There's also graduated guidance. So let's say that a student must have a physical prompt and that's the only thing they respond to. That might start, the book says reducing pressure on a physical prompt. Um, I don't love that wording just because pressure makes me think of using excessive pressure, but really what they mean by that is, that may start from hand over hand, um, by using a hand over hand method, a full physical prompt, to moving to a more guidance level, to moving to just, again, maybe a small physical prompt like a tap or a touch. Then there is time delay. So giving the student more time to show that they can complete the direction or show the skill independently, and just giving some more time between when a direction is given and when we give the prompt. So providing extra wait time. And then increasing assistance. So kind of the backwards of decreasing assistance, obviously, is starting with the least invasive prompt and moving to the more invasive prompt only when needed. So we would start off with a very, very, very small prompt and only moving up when those other prompts aren't working. Effective prompting. Prompts should focus the student's attention on the stimulus, not away from it. So we have to be careful when we prompt. Again, they should be as weak as possible. So starting with the least invasive to the most invasive, they should be faded as quickly as possible. That should always be our goal. And we have to watch for unplanned prompting. I know that I'm a person that does not have a very good poker face. I've worked on it over the years. I don't feel like it's gotten much stronger, but I'm working on it. But facial expressions, vocal inflections can unintentionally serve as a prompt for a student. When you become a teacher and you have to give your first um, standardized assessment, like in Iowa, we use the Iowa assessments, part of the contract, if you will, that you sign, your code of conduct for giving the test, will have in there that if you are reading a test to a student or you are assisting a student with a test, that you will refrain from vocal expressions, or I'm sorry, facial expressions, vocal inflections that may guide the student to choose the correct answer. So, just things to be aware of, because we can unintentionally prompt a student. So when we think about this with our own case study, think about how you can use prompting to teach your case study subject the skills they need to be successful. And we don't have this student live and in front of us, but just think about different ways that they've responded to the teacher. We have that information in some of our ABC data. Think about if it worked or not. If it didn't work, maybe we need to move to a different model of prompting. And this is where, in these next couple parts of your case study, where you'll get to be a little creative and your case study subject may start to look different than someone else's, and that's okay. So again, these questions, I just want you to keep in the back of your mind. We're going to talk about them and talk through them tonight when we meet on Zoom. Another question to keep in mind is, how can you use prompting as a prevention strategy? So think about some of those least invasive prompting prompts, and how can we use those to help prevent that undesired behavior? Is there any type of prompting that we can set up ahead of time to assist the student in demonstrating the desired behavior? And then always keep in the back of your mind how you will fade prompting. This isn't anything that will specifically add to our plan, but it is something that you always want to keep in mind. We cannot follow the student around for the rest of their life and tap them on the shoulder every time they need to pay attention. We have to be able to keep in our minds and be thinking ahead of how we can fade these supports so that the student can be more independent. Authors talk again here about task analysis, and I know we've spent some time on this in the past few weeks, but just to go over it again, because we will want to think about this when we talk about teaching social skills. So again, task analysis is just breaking down a skill into small steps, and we teach each of those steps separately. So we have to make sure that we consider any prerequisite skills that the student may need to have in order to complete a task, including vocabulary. Um, let's go back to our week 8 check for understanding when I had you write a task analysis for washing your hands. If a student doesn't understand what the soap dispenser is, we may need to teach them that vocabulary ahead of time. Or if they don't know where to line up for the sink, we may have to show them that ahead of time. So we have to be thinking about those prerequisite skills. And often when we give directions and they fall apart, it's because the students don't understand part of those directions. So we have to make sure that we break those down and really think about what they need to know before we actually teach them the steps. When we talk about chaining is just the procedure of reinforcing the individual steps when the student is able to show that they can complete them in the correct sequence. On pages 280 and 281 of your text, there are some great examples of how we can monitor and track how a student is able to complete different steps of a task analysis of a skill that's been broken down. One of the models even shows a level of independence, which is really cool. So that just helps us know if our student is making progress when we're teaching them these skills. So when you think about that with your own case study, as you think about the skills that your case study subject needs to learn, think about not only what skills do they need to learn, but what will it look like, um, what will it sound like, when they've mastered that desired behavior, how will we know and how will we be able to monitor it? What steps do we need to take or do they need to take to get them there? The book even talks about some backwards planning, and we can talk about that a little bit tonight in our class. What will they need to know before they learn to perform the desired behavior? So again, what are some prerequisite skills that they may need to learn? What might we need to front load for them? And then how could we monitor this so we know that the student is making progress? We won't add this piece specifically this week to our plan, but it will come up in the next few weeks as we work through the monitoring piece of this. Finally, there are a few video clips that I want you to watch. I think one's a minute and a half, the other one's a little less than 3 minutes, the other one's like 4 minutes, not long at all. I would like you to watch all 4 of these clips. They all refer to teaching social skills and have some different methods of teaching social skills. We're going to spend a good majority of our time tonight on Zoom talking about how we can teach these explicit skills, what explicit skills we want to teach. Sorry, my dog just went nuts. Sorry about that. So I want you to watch these 3 videos. Be ready to discuss when we meet over Zoom. I want you to be able to tell me what you noticed, some similarities between the 3 methods, some differences, and I just really want you to be thinking about what that might look like with your own case study subject and how you could apply some of the practices that they talk about, that they show, that they model into your own teaching of social skills. And again, we're going to talk about that really heavily tonight, but I would like you to watch these 3 videos first. Finally, for this week, you just have 2 assignments. Make sure to complete your week 9 check for understanding quiz that is open from 6:30 until midnight. And then you will have your case study assignment number 5, which is the behavior intervention plan, just the implementation plan part 1. So we're going to talk about prevention strategies and teaching the alternate or replacement behavior. That will be due this Friday at 11:59. And that is all you have for the week. I will see you from 8:45 to, hopefully we won't take until 10, but we will if we need to. So I will see you then. Use the Zoom link on the top of the Moodle page, and we will talk about that case study, go through the different components, and talk about your case study subject. So I will see you all both groups at 8:45.